Hello, and welcome to the 35th episode of this series. Today's podcast episode is on King Henry V, who is perhaps one of the most renowned medieval English kings. Despite only having a 9-year reign from 1413 to 1422, Henry is perhaps one of England's greatest kings, and in fact, would argue was the best medieval monarch, and I define medieval as 1066 to 1485 when Henry VII became king. He really was the epitome of the perfect medieval monarch, which is something that David Starkey says in his book, which has been helping me during this this series. Sorry. So, when you say Henry V, or I say Henry V, you think of Agincourt, and of course that was the thing that everyone remembers, of course. And I'll get onto that. But firstly, Henry was born in 1386 during the reign of King Richard II. He grew to be very tall, at 6'3". He saw glory, personally led to himself and his troops to glory at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, and indeed against the Welsh rebels during the reign of his father. Shakespeare and indeed other portrayals have portrayed Henry as a little bit of a drunk, and I think that's mainly more of a plot device to, show that character development wise, he's in the doldrums, he's not really very competent, he's just like wasting his life, and then is thrust into a role that he didn't necessarily want, and then, leads his country to glory. I get that as a sort of plot point, but there's no evidence to suggest that he actually was, a chronic drunk. And I think the fact that he, was really involved in the Battle of Shrewsbury, say, in 1403, and, helped against the Welsh, and actually showed a lot of political interest in the government, and took his role of Prince of Wales seriously. I mean, he was born in Monmouth itself, and stayed there, and he was known as Henry of Monmouth, so I don't think it's fair to charge him. He may have liked his drink, and he was friends with the character whom Sir John Falstaff was based upon, namely Sir John Oldcastle. The reason why Oldcastle wasn't used as the name of Henry's companion in a Shakespeare play was because the Oldcastle family objected to the sort of the more debauched nature of their activities at the beginning of Henry V, the play. But they were friends, and they may have gone out together and done stuff, but nowhere near the extent that it's sort of seen in Shakespeare. So that is that. So we get to his reign in 1413. He was crowned in a snowstorm, and people weren't sure whether this was a good or a bad omen. Anyhow, in terms of his domestic policy, he did two fairly important things, I think. Firstly, he reinterred King Richard II at Westminster Abbey, because he hadn't previously been buried there. And he did this because he wanted to break with the past and, maybe forget the memory of Henry, his father, deposing Richard, and actually give Richard some respect. He, despite being a really bad king, he was still a king, anointed by God. So he had to grant some legitimacy to that, and put that to bed and reconcile a little bit. And secondly, he did something which is obviously it lasts until today. He made English the language of government, where previously it had been rendered in Norman French, I think, and I think ecclesiastical matters in Latin. But making English the language of government, again, identified the nation with the state, which I think is something I've kind of been getting at recently. It's like, the English nation bred very much within the reign of King Henry V, which is why I think I've referred to him in the past as the first English king rather than just the King of England. Although I think Edward III might be able to claim that title too, as I might have said during his podcast. Anyway, his foreign policy is obviously his most interesting part. So he went to France. The Netflix TV show, or no, it's not TV show, the movie called The King, starring Timothée Chalamet, shows Henry to have been duped by a bull into going into France. Presumably the Dauphin of France, who's like the Prince of Wales, the equivalent, sent Henry a bull, and Henry got annoyed by this, and his nobles said, oh no, this is because he wants to provoke you and you have a casus belli, you can go to war. But actually it was one of his noblemen who, I think it was Exeter, who didn't want, who wanted to protect his lands or his claims in France, so he got Henry to go to war and all the English lives to be lost. I don't think that was entirely accurate. I mean, it might have been true that Exeter had lands there that he wanted to protect, so he had an ulterior motive. But the reason Henry went to war wasn't because of some bull, but because of fact that he had a claim to the French throne and wanted to press it in the same way that his great-grandfather, King Edward III, had initially done when he started the 100 Years' War. So, in August 1415, the English army, led by Henry, besieged Harfleur in Normandy, which at this point is not under English control, Normandy. Then they went to Calais, and on the route they were intercepted at Agincourt, which obviously has been immortalised in history. The English were outnumbered, but they, as you know, won, with their longbowmen coupled with some very, very muddy conditions, which meant that the French cavalry charges and spear charges and, the knights coming through in the heavy armour couldn't get to the English, really, and the longbowmen just picked them off. And the English won the day, and it was one of the most glorious victories in English histories, especially against the French, who considered the older enemy. And this was obviously hugely prestigious for King Henry. It is, of course, in this, bit that in the Shakespeare play that we have the lines, cry God for Harry, England and St. George. I think that's actually during the Siege of Harfleur, but we certainly have the line, we few, we happy few, we merry band of brothers, which is again, another stirring speech like I referred to in Richard II with this blessed plot speech. Very, very stirring. So, with the French beaten in the field at Agincourt, Henry, over the next few years, from 1415 to 1420, went about retaking the ancestral homeland. Basically, he retook Normandy, he took Caen, and he retook Rouen, which was, again, hugely prestigious for him, and he was about to take Paris, but then he realised that there were divisions in the French court, and they were kind of baying out for a new king who was competent. So the King of France at the time, King Charles VI, was considered, to have mental health difficulties, a bit unstable, and his son was seen as a bit incompetent, basically would have been a very bad king. So they thought, okay, Henry could do quite a good job here. And it was actually at the Treaty of Troyes, which Henry negotiated in 1420, that Henry was recognised as the heir to the French throne, which, upon the death of Charles, would have meant Henry would have become the King of France for the King of England. And it would have meant, like, say, with Canute back in 1016, England would have been in personal union with France, which would have been crazy when you think about it, if that had actually happened in real life, and Henry hadn't died in 1422. So, even though the French Parliament actually ratified this deal, because they actually thought it was not too bad, because Henry promised to keep French customs and rule by French ways when he became King of France, some elements of the country still weren't happy, so he had to go on campaign again to enforce his deal. And it was here that he caught dysentery, and he died, which is quite tragic, really, considering what might have happened if he had lived. So that was that. Part of the deal was also that he married Catherine of Valois, who was Charles VI's daughter, and it's through Catherine that Henry had his sole heir, who would become King Henry VI, who's obviously the subject of the next podcast. I think in terms of his legacy, you could go far to call him the Great, maybe. I think the reason why I'm hesitating is because he just didn't reign for long enough. He didn't have long enough to establish. If he'd become King of France as well, which I think had he lived like another year, Charles VI would have been dead, as he was in our timeline, and he would have inherited the throne, Henry. And it's crazy to think he might have inherited the throne and what could have been achieved, and how well he could have kept together. That's what might have earned him the title of the Great. Maybe Henry the Good, Henry the Strong, Henry the Magnificent, but the Great, I think he's just a little bit away from that. That said, as David Starkey said in his book, he was the perfect medieval king. He was the epitome. He was a great general. He was a very clever politician, clearly, by his negotiation of the treaty. He was obviously a spot of bad luck in catching dysentery. But, yeah, he's, really real 3-star man, I think. Not 3-star, 5-star man, making a 3-star general. 3-star general, definitely, but, 5-star man. And, yeah, history could have been very different indeed had he not died the way he did. Anyhow, the next episode will actually be the first episode to feature a guest. So listen for then to hear what they have to say. And yes, I will see you for episode 36. Goodbye.